Good evening. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Felice Levine.
Welcome, everyone. I am Felice Levine, Executive Director of the American Educational Research Association, formerly we call AERA. And on behalf of AERA, I am thrilled to welcome all of you here at the AERA Convening Center in Washington, D.C., and the thousands who have been joining us virtually each year in the live web stream broadcasting for the 2022 Annual Brown Lecture in Education Research, our 19th. For those of you in our public lecture who are less familiar with AERA, the American Educational Research Association was founded in 1916 and is the largest national scientific and scholarly society dedicated to advancing knowledge about education, to encouraging scholarly inquiry related to education, and to promoting use of research to improve education and serve the public good. We stand as an organization committed to the critical importance of education and to the role of scientific research in making education and learning a powerful and effective force of good in the lives of individuals from all backgrounds and from all societies. The commitment is central to why we are here. And I hasten not to say this evening, because there are many time zones here with us today, but place-based Brown Lecture. This year's Brown Lecture is, as I said, the first to be delivered to an in-person audience since the onset of COVID. We have a small and limited audience so that we are COVID sensitive and we are not holding it in a big public venue as we did up through 2019, but we are thrilled to be able to begin that transition back together and to continue to have so many people worldwide join with us so that we can engage with these issues in interaction with virtual participants as well as with place-based participants together. We are experienced. I have no doubt I'm speaking to people who feel this every moment and every day as we do. A great deal of change and uncertainty as a country, politically, socially, in our schools, in every social institution in society, and across societies. We believe that education is vital contributor to how we engage with these issues into the future as we develop and stimulate ways of thinking and knowing that can do better than we have in the past. Tonight's, or whatever your time zone, lecture will address those flashpoints that have become so palpable once again to all of us. Long-standing interpretations of the legacy of the Brown Supreme Court decision and the nation's ongoing reckoning with race and racism will be explored by our speaker and during our discussion forum. I want to just step back and acknowledge the generous support of the 29 Friends of the Brown Lecture. Without them, this event would not be possible. And so may we show that slide to acknowledge our really genuine and heartfelt thanks. And I want to say that's not just about the contributions. It really is much more about the community that joins with us as one for this event. And we have had and been privileged to have friends of Brown since its onset on the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education in 2004. In the case of 1954. Because of the numerous friends, I am not going to read them all to you. I think they're also in the program, which will be posted online. But we thank you and for all you do and for all you do in your own work in collaboration with each other and with us. I also want to thank the Brown Lecture Selection Committee, chaired by Jamel Donner, for its fabulous efforts. The proof of the pudding is in the pie. So the committee did a great job in its selection. Every year they excel and exceed. And we are so pleased that Dr. John Diamond will be delivering the 19th Brown Lecture. I am pleased now to introduce AERA President H. Richard Milner IV, warmly we call Rich, who is not just a preeminent scholar, but Rich was our 2018 Brown lecturer. And so I'm happy to turn this over to you, Rich, with our thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Felice, and thank you to everyone joining us for the 19th Annual Brown Lecture, including those attending in person, as well as the thousands more across the country and around the world joining us virtually. Before continuing, I wish to acknowledge that tonight's event in Washington, D.C. is being held on the homelands of Indigenous peoples on Piscataway land. I ask that you join me in your own way in recognizing the Indigenous peoples on whose land we stand. Thank you. In 2004, AERA inaugurated the Brown Lecture to not only commemorate the U.S. Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education, ending legal racial segregation in schools, but also to acknowledge the social scientists who, at that time, brought innovative ideas to researching and understanding inequities in society. The Brown Lecture is a potentially transformative annual reminder of the central role that research can play in advancing equality in education across racial and ethnic groups, countries of origin, social economics, languages, gender, and sexual identities, as well as a number of other diversity areas. Each year, we select as our speaker a preeminent scholar whose work has contributed substantially to the fight for justice and equity in education. This year, Dr. John Diamond has been selected. Dr. John Diamond is a leading scholar in the study of race and education. As a professor of sociology and education policy at Brown University, he studies the relationships between social inequity and educational opportunity, examining how educational leadership, policies, and practices operate through school organizations that shape students' educational outcomes. Dr. Diamond is the co-author of the award-winning book, Despite the Best Intentions: How Racial Inequality Thrives in Good Schools, and co-editor of Distributed Leadership in Practice. He has also published articles in many journals, including Educational Researcher, Sociology of Education, Teachers College Record, and Urban Education, among others. Numerous media outlets have highlighted his work, including CNN, the New York Times, C-SPAN, Education Week, and several other radio and television stations. In addition to the second edition and writing the second edition of Despite the Best Intentions, Dr. Diamond is writing a new book, Defending the Color Line: the Durability of Whiteness and the Denial of Black Education. We're ready, Doc. We're ready for you. We're ready for that, Doc. We're ready. We are honored for the opportunity to learn from Dr. Diamond's knowledge and wisdom as he examines the deeply embedded role opportunity hoarding and what sustains it. As an AERA fellow, Dr. Diamond's work has been what I call consequential. As I was preparing to introduce John, I reached out to a few colleagues across the country, just to gain insights about Dr. Diamond's work beyond what we find on the bio online. And what I can say for sure is that people reply immediately, which, sometimes can be a challenge. The feedback was just phenomenal. The feedback was phenomenal. So I want to share some of what I heard from about Dr. Diamond. Dr. Amanda Lewis, who is a professor of Black Studies and Sociology at the University of Illinois at Chicago, said, "John is a prolific scholar whose work has far reach beyond the academy." Dr. Mark Warren, professor of public policy and public affairs at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, added, "John models the engaged scholar at his best. He is a deeply caring teacher, mentor, community member, partner, and colleague. Indeed, John is much more than an extraordinary scholar. The sense of community and personal relationships he builds with other scholars and students makes him stand out even more." Dr. Angela Welton, professor of education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, said, "Now, while John is indeed a renowned big-time scholar, what's most important is John is a good human being, genuinely kind." And Jay Hughley, associate professor of social work at the University of Pittsburgh, shared, "John has been a tremendous mentor and brother in the fight for racial justice." And finally, Richard Reddick, professor at the University of Texas at Austin, I think summed it up perfectly. "John is the full package when it comes to being a scholar and a terrific human being." Colleagues and friends, wherever you are, and those of you in the room, I want you to pause for a second. Stop what you're doing, stop what you're doing, stop what you're doing, right? And I want you to send all of the positive energy you can to this stage as we welcome the 2022 AERA Brown Lecturer, John Diamond. Give it up, give it up.
I hope everyone is doing well. I'm really excited to be here. I'd like to thank Executive Director Felice Levine, the Brown Lecture Selection Committee, Tony Pauls, the AERA staff, and President Rich Milner for his leadership of the organization and that wonderful introduction. Thank you. I am truly honored and humbled to have this opportunity to share my thoughts on Brown and its meaning for race and education. But I have a confession. I struggle with our Brown narratives. We rightly treat Brown like a beacon in our struggle for racial justice, but we often downplay the terror, the pain, the suffering that led to the decision and came after. Today, I invite you to join me on a journey of reflection as I wrestle with Brown's legacy and think about how it's impacted me personally. In my talk today, I'll focus on 3 key points. First, I'll use my personal experiences as a window into the limitations of dominant Brown narratives. Second, I detail how white supremacy, white racial ignorance, and opportunity hoarding taint Brown's legacy and undermine racial justice. Third, I ask, how might we reimagine Brown given the permanence of white supremacy as a mode of domination? I've used Du Bois' concept of the color line to frame my talk. And in the Du Boisian tradition, I use my lived experience as a cisgender Black male in the US to ground my comments. My family lineage in the US dates back to an Alabama plantation on my mother's side, and to Opelousas, Louisiana, and East Texas on my father's side, where my formerly enslaved fugitive ancestor chose the last name Diamond to assert his freedom and his humanity. From these roots, both sides of my family made their way to Michigan. They were educated in Black institutions like Morehouse College, taught at schools like Piney Woods in Mississippi, created a trade school for Black electricians in Detroit, and contributed to a rich Black education legacy in Inkster, Michigan, where a school was named for my maternal grandfather. I am a proud inheritor of this legacy. Born during the late stages of the Civil Rights Movement, in the same year Dr. King was assassinated, I entered kindergarten in Lansing, Michigan, amidst white resistance to desegregation, similar to the resistance found in other northern cities. In my elementary school, I was called nigger by white classmates many times and suspended from school for fighting back. In fourth grade, I walked out of school in protest after a teacher grabbed my ear for some innocuous offense. In my mind, this was the last straw in a series of racist violations. I was a strong math student in the early grades. By middle school, however, I was placed in a lower level math class with an inexperienced teacher. The class was disproportionately Black. In high school, my baseball team traveled to Howe, Michigan, at the time a KKK stronghold. When we arrived, we were greeted by a line of students spewing racial epithets our way. We won the game, but at what expense? As I sat down to take my SAT test, a white classmate looked at me and asked a simple question: "Are you smart?" Which of course was a microaggression and a textbook trigger for what Claude Steele calls stereotype threat. My college, graduate school, and professional experiences at PWIs have been punctuated by similar experiences, too numerous to name. My lived experiences give me firsthand connections to the heritage of fugitivity, the power of Black education spaces, the centrality of Black educators in the struggle for racial justice. These experiences also give me a window into the downside of Brown, a downside that is often drowned out by our dominant narratives about racial progress and the celebration of Brown as a watershed moment. In fact, Du Bois understood the pitfalls of integration in 1935 when he wrote, "A separate Negro school where children are treated like human beings, trained by teachers of their own race, who know what it means to be Black, is infinitely better than making our boys and girls doormats to be spit upon and trampled upon." He continued, "The Negro needs neither segregated schools nor mixed schools. What he needs is education." Derek Bell demonstrated a similar ambivalence about integration when he critiqued our almost religious zeal regarding the Brown decision, arguing that the process of integration had become conflated with educational equity itself. This orthodoxy often overrides our ability to understand that integration was a means to an end, a compromise in a white supremacist system in which white racial actors monopolize educational resources for their own children. Therefore, I argue that we can't have a meaningful discussion and debate about school integration absent a careful analysis of how white supremacy structures opportunity and poisons the educational process itself. As a sociologist of education, I've grappled with these issues for over 25 years. Driven trying to understand why racial disparities persist, I've collaborated with educators and community members to work toward racial justice. I've studied many common levers of change, including improving school leadership, leveraging testing and accountability, enhancing parent engagement, raising teachers' expectations. I've created research practice partnerships and worked to make space for community engaged scholarship focused on racial justice. I've also spent a lot of time studying integrated schools, particularly in US suburbs. This work has left me energized and exhausted. A few years ago, I was interviewing a district administrator for my current book project, Defending the Color Line. During the interview, she stopped and took a deep breath and began to talk more slowly, trying to find the right words to express her complex feelings. She started slowly. You know, I think if I did all the things that I've learned over the years and did them well, things would probably still not change a whole lot. We might make things a little better. But I've come to believe that the goals we are trying to achieve require a new order of things, something more radical. Like this administrator, my decades of work have left me impatient and frustrated with the fact that racial justice remains so elusive. I agree with her that we need bolder approaches than we are currently attempting. My vision, however, begins with an honest assessment of why racial domination and school segregation persists. I offer a straightforward answer. Racial domination persists in large part because white supremacy and efforts to defend the color line undermine racial justice. Unfortunately, our theories of race and education have often shied away from interrogating how deeply embedded white supremacy is in the core of our organizations, and how white racial actors and institutions help sustain it. Our work is often infused with aspirational progress narratives, characterized by deficit-oriented characterizations of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students and families, and focused on the myth of Asian overinvestment in education, a model minority myth, which also normalizes and centers whiteness. And finally, we've been protective of white racial actors' emotions, even as these same actors work to sustain the racial status quo. Along with researchers and scholars and critical race scholars like Derek Bell, I believe it is imperative that we take the permanence of racism seriously and examine schools as they are, rather than as we wish they were. Our education system emerged from the context of settler colonialism and chattel slavery, which reverberate today in what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, and what Kiana Ross calls the afterlife of school segregation. Given this history and contemporary reality, treating schools as inherently racially just institutions denies their history as sites of an enduring struggle between white supremacy and racial justice. To be clear, I use white supremacy in ways that are untethered from common images of racist hate groups. Instead, I view white supremacy as Francis Lee Ainsley describes it, a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas about white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. Now, let's turn to the question of the color line. Du Bois famously wrote that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The relations of the darker and lighter races in Asia and Africa and America and the islands of the sea. The color line often evokes the image of a physical line separating whites from other racialized groups, which is a critical dimension of the concept. It is a racial boundary with the spoils of global exploitation concentrated on the white side of the line. In this sense, whiteness leads to well-documented material advantages. School segregation is designed to dissolve the physical color line, to equalize resources and create greater educational equity. The color line is also a symbolic boundary across which racial meaning is constructed. Most of us are familiar with Du Bois's discussion of the two-ness of being Black and American, as well as the idea of second sight, the ability to see the inner workings of the white world. However, the color line also constructs racial meaning on the white side of the line. First, whites internalize myths of white superiority. Second, they benefit from what Du Bois called the psychological wages of whiteness, a form of status advantage akin to modern constructions of white privilege. Finally, whites are unable to see the humanity and lived experiences of the racialized subjects on the other side of the line. So the color line is a physical and a symbolic boundary through which racial domination is established and maintained. Defending the color line is the ongoing, evolving process through which these boundaries are reproduced and sustained. And opportunity hoarding is the mechanism or a key mechanism used to defend the color line. So let's turn to opportunity hoarding, a concept originally developed by sociologist Charles Tilly, and how it is used to defend the color line. The history of school integration has been an endless attempt to coerce and cajole white parents to send their children to schools with large numbers of Black and Latinx students, something a mountain of research demonstrates they avoid. Our strategies have not worked on large scale because of the various ways that white racial actors and institutions resist integration. So let me return to my childhood school district of Lansing, Michigan. A year before I started elementary school, the Lansing School District adopted a cluster plan to desegregated schools. However, the plan was resisted by a group of white parents calling themselves Citizens for Neighborhood Schools. Sound familiar, right? As Judge Noel Fox wrote in his NAACP versus Lansing School District opinion, before the cluster plan could be implemented, some Lansing residents undertook to delay and prevent the implementation of the cluster plan by removing from office those board members who had voted for the plan and replacing them with members who were hostile to the desegregation plan. One of the recalled board members, Hortense Kennedy, was actually a family friend. The recall was successful, and the new board rescinded the plan. Here we see opportunity hoarding at work and the collective effort of white racial actors to obstruct and delay school integration. As Lansing Community College historian David Seawick argues, the rubber met the road when busing began to mix races in schools. Resistance to integration was a backdrop on which I started school, and perhaps a reason for the racially hostile elementary school environment I experienced. These patterns of resistance were repeated in every region of the country. Historically, opportunity hoarding was carried out through the formation of white political power bases in suburban communities that led to the appointment of county, state, federal judges who rolled back civil rights gains, maintained community and school segregation across cities and suburbs, and supported local funding mechanisms that concentrated financial resources in majority white communities. Within these communities, whites used restrictive covenants and racial violence to keep people of color out. However, opportunity hoarding is not just a thing of the past. Currently, district boundaries, attendance zones, local funding schemes, and district secession continue to create and maintain racially separate and unequal schools. In a recent AERJ paper, Genevieve Siegel-Holly and her colleagues discussed district secession in the Memphis and Shelby County schools. In 2013, the Shelby County and Memphis school districts were consolidated. This created a more racially diverse school system with more equitable distribution of resources. The reaction to this change was swift and decisive. White elites used district secession to establish 6 new suburban school districts that were whiter and more affluent. After 1 year of a countywide district, 6 new suburban districts were created in 2014. The remaining Shelby County district was 78% Black and 79% low income, compared to the newly formed suburban districts that were at least 62% white and 36% low income, and under 36% low income. Some argue this is exactly why we need integrated schools. However, opportunity hoarding happens in integrated contexts as well. In our book, Despite the Best Intentions, and its forthcoming expanded second edition, Amanda Lewis and I study the numerous ways opportunity hoarding undermines the promise of integration in a racially diverse urban high school located in a local match we call Riverview. Here, white parents use tracking to monopolize education resources for their children. Riverview, like many other US school systems, white and East Asian students are concentrated in honors and advanced placement classes, while Black and Latinx students are concentrated in lower level classes. When district officials tried to detract, white parents resisted. One administrator told us that they had over 200 meetings with white parents to assure them that they were not dumbing down the curriculum. Processes like these obstruct and delay racial progress. In my current book, Defending the Color Line, I highlight how white parents delayed the detracking process in middle school math, something that impacted me directly when I was in school. In one of the districts I studied, the path to AP Calculus required taking Algebra 1 in 8th grade. The problem was that Black and Latinx students were disproportionately enrolled in pre-algebra rather than Algebra 1. So over time, district leaders and teachers tried to consolidate pre-algebra and Algebra 1, making the classes identical. However, when they tried to eliminate pre-algebra, they faced resistance from white parents. As one district administrator explained, by the time we got to the board meeting, we basically could say, hey, kids have the same scope and sequence, the same book, the same materials. We don't need pre-algebra, we can get rid of it. And there was pushback, mostly from white people, exclusively from white people. This exemplifies how opportunity hoarding works in practice. According to district leaders, this change could have happened in 1 year. Instead, it took 4. So let me shift from the physical boundaries to how education cultivates racial ideology and racial ignorance, and how they embed themselves in school organizational practices. With all the emphasis on education as a mechanism of social mobility, we sometimes forget that it is a vital tool used to prop up the myth and structural foundation of white supremacy. Education reproduces relations of domination through what Carter G. Woodson called miseducation. As a tool of imperialist white supremacy in places like Hawaii, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, education sought to destroy indigenous cultures, to promote US empire. It's been used to turn the murderous colonizer into the righteous savior, the settler colonialist into the innocent explorer, and the slaveholder into the benevolent statesman. Beginning in infancy, repeated exposure to racial ideologies of this type are racial subjectivity in ways that perpetuate implicit and explicit beliefs that favor whiteness. Hearing these ideologies repeated in conversation, consuming them through various forms of media, and learning them in schools sends powerful messages that help sustain racial domination. As James Baldwin argued, quote, to be white was to be forced to digest a delusion called white supremacy. And this delusion impacts all of us. For many, these racial ideologies become taken for granted knowledge. As one Riverview High School student stated when we interviewed him for Despite the Best Intentions, I'm white, so I'm expected to be smarter. When someone sees me, they always think I'm smarter than most people. I think usually the perception is that Black people are dumber than white people and Hispanics are not as smart as everyone else, end quote. His statement reminds me of my pre-SAT classmate question about my intelligence, suggesting that Blackness and smartness could not coexist. These ideas about whiteness and white supremacy become deeply ingrained in conscious and subconscious racial thinking. Prefiguring work on implicit bias, Du Bois wrote the following passage in his book, Dusk of Dawn. Quote, "The present attitude and action of the white world is not based solely upon rational, deliberate intent. It is a matter of conditioned reflexes, of subconscious trains of reasoning, and unconscious nervous reflexes. These taken for granted beliefs embed themselves in our practices inside our organizations. Inside our organizational routines like grading, tracking, parent-teacher meetings, and discipline practices, all in ways that advantage white students and disadvantage students of color. Education also helps create white racial ignorance, which sustains racial domination by stopping conversations about racial justice in their tracks. As philosopher Charles Mills writes, ignorance is usually thought of as the passive obverse of knowledge. But imagine an ignorance that resists. Imagine an ignorance that fights back. Imagine an ignorance militant, aggressive, not to be intimidated, an ignorance that is active, dynamic, that refuses to go quietly, propagated at the highest levels of the land, indeed presenting itself unblushingly as knowledge. This cultivated ignorance requires work, and schools have often done that work. Our educational institutions glorify whiteness in everyday practice in large and small ways. So let me give you a personal example. During a college political science class, a professor started the class by asking a simple question. He said, does anyone know who Cecil Rhodes is? I was annoyed. So I raised my hand and I answered, he's a white supremacist imperialist who was responsible for the death of millions of people in Southern Africa. So it's not the answer he's looking for, of course. He thought we would just say, you know, he's a namesake of the Rhodes Scholarship. Because education has the power to rationalize domination, produce ignorance, and promote liberation, access to it and the form it should take have been a central fault line in the nation's racial history. From anti-literacy laws and the creation of fugitive education spaces that Jarvis Gibbons discusses in his book, Fugitive Pedagogy, to segregation and the fight that led to the Brown decision. Education is a terrain on which racial conflict plays out. And one current strategy to prevent people from even talking about race is something that's happening in the current moment. In research for Defending the Color Line, I demonstrate how white racial actors keep race off the table in multiple ways. For example, in interviews with district leaders, they discuss how white racial actors push them to take race out of their strategic plans. As one administrator stated, in our original draft of our plan, we were very explicit about addressing Black kids and Latinx kids. And we got some pushback by white members of the community, and actually some of our educators. And we went back and forth, and I didn't put a stake in the ground around race in the first strategic plan. Another way people and institutions defend the color line is by silencing and discrediting dissent. In one middle school district, a mid-sized district I studied, Black students were 18% of the student population, but they were 82% of the students arrested by police. A youth activist group brought their concerns to the school board for multiple years, making a compelling case for ending the district's police department contract. However, they used language and demeanor that some objected to. Kind of like Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, you know, that's so offensive, right? Various efforts were made to silence the group, and local media argued that the group was bullying the school board members. These local examples bring to mind the current anti-CRT legislation that has swept the country. which also works to silence dissent. Using media outlets to create a moral panic, critical race theory went from a theoretical tool taught in graduate schools to a supposed threat to K through 12 students who had never been exposed to it in the first place. Since 2021, at least 36 states have introduced anti-CRT legislation. Moreover, these efforts have been coupled with continued voter suppression, anti-trans legislation, and the banning of books focused on LGBTQI plus literature and racial justice. While some legislative efforts have failed, the chilling effect throughout K-12 and higher education has been palpable. And individual teachers worry that they might face sanctions for teaching history that makes white students feel uncomfortable. The folly, of course, is that Black, Asian, Latinx, Indigenous students face indignities in school daily. The kind of indignities that accumulated into my walking out of school in 4th grade. So, where do we go from here? Consistent with arguments regarding the permanence of racism, we must disrupt whiteness, white supremacy, and opportunity hoarding, recognizing their vulnerability as well as their resilience. This leads me to see the struggle against racial oppression and other linked forms of domination as part of a humanizing struggle to make schools less harmful. In the final few minutes, I want to offer some examples of my own efforts to disrupt and highlight some intriguing work that others are engaged in. I don't see these as a pathway to the proverbial promised land. Instead, I see them as opportunities to create fissures in the color line that can be exploited. First, while I've painted a relatively bleak picture so far, I acknowledge that, I believe many educators are committed, and I should say most educators are committed to making their schools better for all young people. Building on this commitment, I engage with educators inside schools. My approach builds on an understanding that white supremacy is deeply embedded in educators' racial subjectivity, school organizational routines, and broader structures outside of schools. As a result, I emphasize 4 things in my work with educators. First, disrupting current thinking and practice. Second, providing new conceptual tools for understanding white supremacy and its implications. 3, working with people to deconstruct organizational routines and reconstruct them in ways that might lead to more racial justice. And 4th, encouraging working in solidarity with broader justice movements. One effort that I've engaged in is critical book studies. To date, I've collaborated with hundreds of educators and community members across the country to help them walk through these 4 steps. In other work, I've worked with district leaders in research practice partnerships to disrupt, deconstruct, and redesign organizational routines in ways that make them more racially just. In this work, I've helped leaders think about how to redesign vital organizational routines while foregrounding racial justice. For example, infusing racial justice imperatives into high leverage routines along the educator pipeline, like preparation, hiring, induction, coaching, professional learning, that directly impact all educators. One of my current projects with colleagues from several institutions examines the development of equity-centered principal pipelines across the country. I'm excited also by the work of engaged scholars like Dakota Irby, Mohammed Khalifa, Sarah Dean, AJ Welton, and Ishimaru, who've thought deeply about how to create anti-racist approaches to school leadership, community engagement, and organizational change. But resistance needs to extend beyond the walls of the school, because external disruption is among the most powerful forces and tools we have to create ruptures in the color line. linking our actions inside schools and communities to community organizing, to social movements for justice is a fundamental ingredient in challenging white supremacy. For instance, the 2020 racial justice protests created a groundswell of energy that led to the termination of police contracts in some cities, something youth activists had advocated for decades. Mark Warren's book, Willful Defiance, is an excellent account of how Black and Latinx parents built the movement to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline through local and national action. And yet, as I close, I return to Derek Bell's insistence that we not lose sight of the permanence of racism. As he writes, Black people will never gain full equality in this country. Even those Herculean efforts we hail as successful will produce no more than temporary peaks of progress, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. These peaks of progress, like the Voting Rights Act, like affirmative action, like Brown itself, are all worth fighting for, and we must. They are vital tools in our struggle against white supremacy and other forms of oppression. But we must remember that the color line always reconstitutes itself. As Bell argues, our struggle is a manifestation of our humanity that survives and grows stronger through resistance to oppression, even if that oppression is never overcome. I struggle to claim my humanity, to honor my ancestors, to build on the legacy of Black educators and institutions, and to try to create liberatory education spaces inside schools and beyond. But all of our humanity depends on this struggle. And I call on all of us to join it. Thank you.
In fact, you can do better than that. Those in the room, you can do better than that. That's right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Diamond, for such a moving, illuminating, and powerful lecture. I mean that sincerely. Your knowledge and insights into the challenges facing our nation's schools and school systems and our broader society serves as not only a wake-up call to many, but also an intellectual call to action for our community of scholars, policymakers, practitioners. We will now move to the discussion portion of the evening. I invite our distinguished guests to join me on the panel. And one more time, y'all, let's give it up for Dr. Diamond. Thanks you again. Yes. Dr. Diamond, our moderator, and two commentators will examine the relevance of the issues of the lecture to educators, school and policy leaders, and others across the world, and how they might connect to policies, programs, and practices. Our commentators will make brief initial remarks to kick off the conversation, but we highly encourage you to participate. We encourage you to ask questions and participate in the conversation. We have microphones for those of you in person, and viewers on live stream should post your questions now in Q&A box. Those questions will be curated and synthesized by Dr. George Wimberly, AERA's Director of Professional Development and Diversity Officer. I am pleased now to introduce our moderator for this event. Aaliyah Wong is an award-winning reporter at USA Today, where she covers inequalities in education. She began her journalism career as a watchdog education reporter at Honolulu's Civic Beat. Previously, Aaliyah worked as a staff writer and associate editor at The Atlantic, where she developed its education section. She has also served as a volunteer teacher, and I probably should have started with that, right? Now I will turn it over to Aaliyah, who will briefly introduce our two commentators and begin our discussion.
Thanks so much, Rick. Well, I'll start by introducing our commentators. To my immediate left, we have Akila Aline, and she is the Director and Team Lead for K-12 Education Policy at the Center for American Progress. She's also on the Board of Directors of the ACLU of Delaware and recently completed her PhD in sociology. Yeah, round of applause on that. And then to her left, we have Michelle Molitor. She is the Executive Director of the Equity Lab. And prior to that, she was the founding administrator of E.L. Haynes Public Charter School. And before that, she was a teacher as well in Fairfax County Public Schools. So with the introductions out of the way, yeah. So I'd like to kick us off by talking about opportunity hoarding in the aftermath of the pandemic. And in a moment when it feels like certain politicians have had great success at really harnessing the fears of white parents. So what is happening right now? And I'll have you kind of start us off, Dr. Diamond, but what is happening right now? And what do these trends say about the limitations and the role of Brown? And by extension, how can we counter what seems to be increasingly blatant and unapologetic sort of white supremacy in our education systems?
Yeah, I mean, I can say a few things about that, and then I'd like to invite colleagues here to jump in and
yeah, actually, let me start. Sorry, I shouldn't have gotten us right into the conversation. I wanted them to share some reflections for 3 minutes. Sorry about that.
So I'll go ahead and start. First, I just want to say, Dr. Diamond, powerful lecture, fantastic. Thank you for sharing with us. I'd also like to thank the Executive Director of AERA, Felice Levine, for inviting me to speak today. And I'd also like to give special thanks to the staff for helping put together this evening. So I've prepared a few minutes of written remarks, so you will see me reading, but I'd love to open up the conversation after Michelle has gone, and we're looking forward to this conversation. So if you listen to some of the stories, some of the context that Dr. Diamond shared, you'll hear that former students of desegregation, like Dr. Diamond himself, and those interviewed in my past work, have undergone commuting unimaginable distances and they've adjusted to new curriculums and social settings post-Brown. They experienced disruptions in learning settings that Black communities had built prior to Brown. Brown, as we all know, was a landmark case that ultimately led, however, to the permanent close of hundreds of schools in historically Black neighborhoods. The stories that were uncovered in my doctoral work, as well as the ongoing work of Dr. Diamond and others, have revealed how the true burden of Brown was the placement of an obligation or responsibility by way of law on Black families to acquire the necessary transportation and funds needed to physically place themselves in schools and institutions that were initially designed for white students to succeed. The burden of Brown, then, of simply attaining an education did not fall on white children and their families. It fell on Black children and their communities. Today, we know that law does not operate on its own. Derek Bell explained that there's a vexed, inextricable bond between racial power and law. People, humans, decision makers, these are the people who make it happen. These are the people who make law happen. Yes, it's true that humans are subject to biases and error, but without challenging and righting the wrongs of the past, the problems that we faced then remains in these systems and institutions which operate as this bond between law and racial power, which cannot be easily separated. Derek Bell asserts that in order to attempt to change this, we must challenge it. During the time that the Brown decision was decided, Derek Bell, a legal scholar at the time, wrote a piece called Serving Two Masters: Integration Ideals and Client Interests in School Desegregation. In his writings, he explained that there was significant disagreement concerning what Chief Justice Warren called, in quotes, equal educational opportunities through the concentration of, in quotes, racial balance. and maximum feasible desegregation. More specifically, he argued that the successful integration between racially isolated neighborhoods would be impossible for large urban areas in both the South and the North unless commitments were made at the local and state levels to transport students from both neighborhoods, both Black and white, into integrated schools over these long distances. Bell's final assessments revealed that white families made no commitments to long distance due to low confidence in the quality of education provided in Black schools. They perceived the education provided in Black schools had little or no benefit to their white children. Black families, on the other hand, did commit to these long distances. According to Bell, Black families made these commitments even when they doubted the success of integration, even when they had low confidence in the quality of education in white schools. The reason why the Brown case is such a great example to use as an exercise in this conversation, particularly ones about governance and education, is because education, schooling, knowing, and knowledge are topics that impact all aspects of the human ecosystem and the functioning of life. What's taught in the classroom helps inform our understandings of the challenges that we face here in the United States. But you can't have a just society in the United States without a focus on the greatest market economy that helped build America into the powerhouse that it is today. That is the US Constitution, America's first example of governance, and slavery, one of America's biggest, most successful economies. These are evidence of the inextricable link between race and law that's been grandfathered into the society that we live in today. On this topic of the current political debate, which Dr. Diamond so gracefully explained and described to us concerning book bannings and changes with school curriculum, we're not just having CRT be mischaracterized and misplaced in discussions about school curriculum. Misinformation about the theory has stemmed into the discourse for the public, as well as into evolving discourses in the academy. We're seeing people construct pseudoscience to counter much of the work that's already been done before me, through me, and the work that we're doing right here in this room by engaging in this debate. The gain of Black children from being at home at the heart of their family, as opposed to going to a new space, a white space, was lost. Funding and resources, which is what was being asked of policymakers, particularly NAACP attorneys who were fighting the Brown case, was not actually obtained in practice. Black teachers lost their jobs. We saw a mass closing of what today we'd call community schools. These are the experiences that need to be brought into these public discourses. But more importantly, they do need to be brought into the classrooms as well. Whether it's policy or practice, teaching civic culture, overall, together is important, not only for diffusing partisan tribalism, but also for parsing out and tearing down imperialist structures. As we continue to see how the politicization of US schools is unfolding in modern day through these book banning and curricular changes and other conversations, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to engage in civil discourse surrounding how to build new systems and how to cultivate new discussions and opportunities to address these issues while dismantling old ones that perpetuate it. Thank you.
First, thank you, Dr. Diamond, for your very moving lecture, and want to thank AERA for inviting me, and then of course Ali and Akila. So I want to start off by telling you about my own lived experience. I was born in the 70s to a Black mother and a white father in a suburb right outside Detroit. Michigan's race relations of that time and arguably now are just as John describes. But in my experience, these tensions and indignities were also happening right in my own home. My father absolutely loved my mother, but his proximity to her and us never translated to his understanding of how white supremacy was working on him, on his family, on my family. Whether it was ranting about affirmative action or belittling movements he didn't understand, hanging on to bootstrap theories or blaming people's circumstances on their mere existence instead of examining the systems that categorically maintain inequity. Or perhaps most detrimentally, not believing us or wanting to talk about the very real racism that we experience on a regular basis. My father's love for us and proximity to us, to Black people, didn't change his behavior or beliefs. He was in many ways unwilling to do the work and unwilling to challenge what he had been socialized to believe. Nationally, we have only ever really practiced desegregation or being proximate to one another. There's never been a collective investment in all of us doing the work, an honest and true integration where we deeply value each other's humanity and support our collective efforts to thrive. The work begins at home and in schools, and in the public places where we live and work and eat and worship. Desegregation can be regulated, but integration requires more. White supremacy culture is deeply embedded, and its extraction from our bodies, our relationships, our policies, and our lives requires all of us to practice a different way of being and doing. It starts in our families, our communities, and our schools. It's not only being proximate, but being able to see the systems of oppression and their benefits to some and their detriment to others. True integration requires the acknowledgement of white supremacy culture and a commitment to being different, doing different. To truly integrate and to do the work requires three things. First, we have to focus on education. We at the Equity Lab believe that the most dangerous conversation about race is the one we don't have. Do we understand our history? Do we understand the modern manifestations of racism's insidious nature? Do we then use that understanding to take a different path and design a new future? Second, we have to have a true understanding of systems, not as some abstraction, but how we actually are with each other and in groups. Do the policies we put in place bring us together or distance us from one another? Are we functioning in and being driven by fear? Or can we be driven by love and a belief that we can thrive together? And finally, we all have to heal. We have to deeply understand and practice healing from our internalized superiority and inferiority. We've all become adjusted to the way things are with systems designed to keep us apart instead of the way they could be. We have to practice being the new people we deserve to be. We have to ground all of this in love. This takes all of us. During the time of Brown and so many decades since, there have been too many of the unwilling and the willfully ignorant taking up too much space in the conversation, never intending to do their work individually or collectively. The only way for us to truly thrive in whatever communities we live in is to work to create spaces of belonging for all. We have to do the work of educating ourselves, the work of understanding and challenging systems, and the work of healing for ourselves, for each other, and for humanity. I love my father, and he's come a long way. We continue to talk, we continue to argue. We also don't give up on one another and the possibilities of coming to a greater understanding of a path forward that allows everyone to thrive. In a convocation speech at Illinois Wesleyan, Martin Luther King shared these words: "Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so it is necessary to help time and to realize that time is always right to do right." Thank you.
Thank you so much for setting the table with those insights and perspectives. Really enlightening. And now that I'm going to kick off the Q&A for real this time, I want to remind people in the audience to come up and prepare your questions. If you have them, you can line up in the middle of the room, and then those in the audience can share your questions online. But back to that first question, opportunity hoarding in this moment, a moment when it really feels like the ignorance that fights back is that it really heightened. What is happening right now? What does it say about the role and or the limitations of Brown? And how do we overcome the fear that so many white parents have who are concerned about whether it's redistricting or CRT or gender ideology, you know, whatever language they're using these days? How do we overcome that fear? We can start with you, Dr. Diamond, but I want everyone to chime in.
Yeah, that's a tough question. So yeah, I'll start. I mean, I think it's important to think about, I think the broader sort of connections across all of these things. So for me, I see a lot of sort of institutional, a lot of things fighting back, right? So white supremacy, patriarchy, or really cis heteropatriarchy. You know, as we see population demographics shifting, as we see, you know, this fear of people losing their sort of position in society, there's an immediate push for people to say, well, a white person saying, I need to do what's best for my kid. But the broader structures are sort of pushing people and manipulating people into thinking that their only issue that they need to be concerned about is the one that directly affects them, right? The one that is, you know, the position in society that they're most afraid of losing, right? But what winds up happening in that sort of investment in whiteness, that sort of investment in patriarchy, is that people can be manipulated into doing things that really aren't in their best interest, right? All of our humanity is tied up with each other. And to the extent that we don't value the lives of others, we get tricked into working against our own self-interest, right? And so I think we really need to begin to sort of broaden our perspective on what it means to be part of a democratic society, to be part of a society that is dependent on people who may not look like you, who may not live where you live, who may not be sort of in the geography that you feel comfortable in, or may not be in the political party that you endorse. Because ultimately, what seems to me to be happening is all of those individual interests, the desire of men to have power over women, the desire of the elites to have power over the working class, the desire for whites to have power over everyone else is causing our society to disintegrate, right? To the extent that we don't deal with that, we may wake up to a society that doesn't look like we thought it should, that we think it should. And so I would urge people to try to open your mind to understand that we're all connected. That may not be the answer to your question, but it's something that I'm sort of feeling right now pretty deeply, that we need to be changing our perspective.
Yeah, I can also add to that. When it comes to this fear that you're talking about, we're seeing that it's not just a fear that is sort of coming up and being riled up in Congress or amongst elected officials. This fear has trickled down to classrooms already. So we have teachers who have a fear of losing their jobs. We have kids who have a fear of speaking up in class or raising a question concerning something that they may not have a clear understanding of, or even feeling as though they want to open up the conversation to talk about what they're experiencing at home. That may have something to do with their family structures, or they simply might just be inquiring about some lost lineage or lost family history. And so it's deeply problematic that we have come to a place in the US society where students, teachers, even parents have to feel like they have to advocate and pass some sort of law in order to simply be able to get educated. Dr. Diamond mentioned there was a quote, I believe the quote was from W.E.B. Du Bois, and the quote said that Black students don't need to be integrated or mixed into classrooms, or segregated or mixed into classrooms, they need to be educated. And so that is part of the larger discussion that we need to be having right now, instead of focusing on these culture wars and focusing on, you know, who can teach what and who's ultimately comes down to whose voice really matters in the classroom. We really need to be having a larger conversation about how our school systems are structured, how institutions were designed from the very beginning, and do those institutions thrive today? And are they set up, do they set children up for success? And we know that the answer is no. So we do need to start having these hard conversations, these difficult conversations, and the time is now, so.
The only thing I would add in addition to that is that I think we talk about, we need a narrative shift. We talk about this as a zero-sum game and that there's not enough for everybody. And because we operate from a place of scarcity, and if my child doesn't have and your child can't have, when we operate from that space instead of operating from a place of generative possibility and abundance, we limit our dreams of the future, and we limit we stay steeped in fear rather than thinking about possibility and what there is to be gained. So I think we need nationally a narrative shift.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because one of the things that strikes me is, yes, I mean, there's been a sort of declining fortunes in our society, that fewer and fewer people are able to sort of make more than their parents did. But part of the reason for that is because people don't come together across these lines of difference and figure out that there are a small percentage of people who are benefiting and the rest of us are down here struggling, fighting with each other, right? So I mean, that narrative shift is really about understanding that your interest might not be, the first thing that pops up in your mind about why, what your value is. It might be looking at somebody who doesn't look like you and figuring out how to build a coalition, right? I mean, so for me, foundationally, it's always fascinating to me that the few can control the rest of us, right? And we really need to be thinking about what does it mean to be a pawn in that kind of system. So anyway, that's.
So we'll take the audience Q&A so we can weave it in with my Q&A. So you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Kalila Harris. I am grateful to be here this evening. Thank you for the invitation, Dr. Aline. And I want to build on something that you said. When we think about the Brown decision, oftentimes I like to lift up for people the majority decision that talks about the impossibility of Black children being able to have a high quality education with only Black children, and how inherently flawed and racist that is, whilst people uphold the Brown decision as the pinnacle of what we should be trying to achieve. So I'd love for you all to just puzzle on a little bit the concept of solidarity and the concept of building coalition within the frame of upholding a North Star that says Black children cannot have a quality education in a classroom or schoolhouse filled with Black children. We've been talking about the fact that we've done desegregation, but not integration, and how desegregation was done to Black children and not with all of the children in communities seeking to build. So I'd love for you to puzzle on that and offer your insights or thoughts on how we meld both what Bell talked about in terms of the inherency of racism and white supremacy in our society, the concept that our school systems and frankly, our current policy is built on this flawed concept of equality. And if we just give equally, all the children can thrive, yet we propose policies that on their face and implicitly say that Black children cannot possibly learn the way white children can. And of course, there are dynamics in between Black, white, and multiracial, and children from different ethnicities with different abilities and different experiences in school. But would love to hear how you think about our melding the concept of Black children inherently being able to be successful in school, establishing the resources and policies that support that, and building coalition and solidarity such that people aren't prioritizing their own under a concept of exceptionalism, right? Because what's embedded there is my children are exceptional and I need to do a little bit more for your children who are not. Thank you.
Can I jump in on that?
Yes.
So there's nothing inherently inferior about a Black school. Full stop, right? I go back to my mother, who went to an all-Black school in Inkster, Michigan. And she talked about a teacher named PZ, who she waited to get into her classroom in high school because this teacher's reputation spread throughout the community as an English teacher who was amazing. So my mother went to Ohio State University after graduating from Inkster High. And her first paper that she wrote in college, the professor was giving them their papers back, and the professor started reading from a paper and said, "This was the best paper I received." And my mother was like, "This sounds like something I wrote." Turns out my mother's paper from her all-Black school in Inkster, Michigan, was the best paper in this class with over 100 students, right? So there's nothing inherently inferior about Black schools, but the idea that Brown was a compromise was rooted in the fact that global exploitation and slavery had led to whites being able to monopolize the resources and keeping Black folks out of the schools. So we know there were great Black schools, but oftentimes they were working against a resource disparity that was hard to overcome. So the best way to deal with that in some ways was to sort of push for integration. So it's a compromise in a system that's white supremacist at its foundation and core. So we can't fall into this idea that Black schools can't be excellent, right? We just simply have to reject that. And it's not true. But we wind up in a society that is, you know, where the color line is so strong and where the resources are concentrated on one side of the line, and these narratives are out there, that it's hard for us sometimes to think beyond around what's possible for us.
So first I want to say, Dr. Harris, thank you for the question and thank you for joining us this evening. I really love that question because when I was doing my doctoral studies, I realized through the interviews and looking through the archival documents that the irony of Brown is that Black students were actually doing significantly better prior to being integrated. And a lot of folks don't really know that portion of the story. As I was watching these interviews and listening to these former students of segregated schools, they talked about how their scores, their SAT scores were so high that word ended up getting around the different districts into the white schools that the Black students were exceeding the expectations that were placed in those schools. And so that really was the propeller for integration. And so I want us to have a really strong understanding of why integration actually happened. As I was digging through the Brown case and I was thinking about, well, what was Thurgood Marshall thinking, you know, when he asked for this? I started reading a little bit of his notes. I started reading some of the court documents, and I realized that the decision to integrate was actually made at the very last minute. Initially, as Dr. Diamond had just mentioned, Black communities, Black schools, Black parents were only asking for more funding. This was a fiscal equity issue. They were simply asking for more funds to buy more books, to update their curriculum. And as you know, as humans, as you grow older, your intellectual compass grows. You learn more, you need more books to keep up with the knowledge that you're learning. And so they were simply asking for more money to buy more books. And there was a lot of conversation back and forth in the courts that we don't think that this is actually going to get us to win the case. We need to ask for something a little bit more drastic, a little bit more extreme. Not only that, whatever the ask was needed to be favorable to white families as well. And so that is where integration came into place. Now, before schools actually became desegregated fully, Black and white children were playing together in some communities. They were actually having play dates, having community playtime together. They still weren't going to the same schools, but they were interacting with each other. And so what happened, this is why it's so important to look at what was actually happening during segregation at the ground level and really look at what was going on in those communities, because Black families started talking to white families, talking about what was going on in their schools, what their kids were learning, and there was a conversation of, okay, white families started to say, we want our kids to get educated and to be achieving these scores in the same way that Black kids are too. And so that's really what landed on integration. And so, but as I was mentioning earlier, the real burden of Brown is that Black students really lost. They lost their teachers after integration happened. Black teachers, Black women particularly, were making up the majority of teachers at the time. They were being asked to get more credentials, higher credentials, and this became problematic. At that time, Black families were using family members to teach the kids in the classroom. So this wasn't just a typical school system in segregated Black schools. Family members were teaching family members. Children were learning cultural values about what was going on at home and how that related to what they needed to learn for the future. So when you lost Black teachers, you lost Black principals, and then ultimately Black schools closed, you have Black children who have already been assimilated to their own upbringing, their own culture, now coming into schools where it's culture shock. They don't understand the curriculum. These curriculums weren't designed for them. And so no one has ever rectified or addressed that issue. And we still see that being an ongoing problem today, where there's this narrative of Black children don't want to learn, or Black children can't learn, or they're somehow inherently deficient or less intelligent, and that's not the case. But we do know through the research that I'm doing, and as well as Dr. Diamond and others, is that Black children are extremely capable, highly capable, overly capable of succeeding academically. However, you really have to make sure that assessment systems, testing structures are culturally appropriate and culturally aligned with how Black children, Black families learn and interact and communicate with each other. So those are the conversations we need to be having now.
I'll ask a question now. I want to get to this before the end of the night. Let's talk about the teacher shortages and turnover. You know, what the headlines have often glossed over is the fact that these shortages are really, you know, they compound and underscore the profession's diversity problem, this real persistent mismatch between students in our schools and the educators who serve them. So I want you to reflect on those, you know, workforce, those pipeline challenges, and how they're both a consequence and a manifestation of the color line and its evolving persistence in our school systems. And anyone can chime in.
Your questions are always deeply, you know, sort of thought-provoking and
That's the
challenging.
point.
Yeah. So I think part of our focus in some ways, I mean, part of our focus is, and it goes back to what Akilah was saying, that where we are in terms of, you know, educators in part has to do with sort of these desegregation process and sort of the loss of a lot of educators. But I think a bigger challenge for us right now is that we've made education a very difficult place to be. We've made schools a tough place to work. And, you know, people who have the skills and talents that are required to come into education, I think over the last 20 to 30 years have sort of found it very difficult to have a meaningful career in education, because so often we are denigrating teachers. So often we are forcing them to fit into mandates that are generated by people who have never been in a classroom. We're asking people to respond to testing and accountability mechanisms that are rooted in sort of neoliberal policy initiatives that really may not necessarily be about educating young people, but may be about other agendas that people have. And in the current context, we're dealing with people who have, you know, the immediate context of dealing with COVID and how teachers, you know, we said a lot about first responders and how valiant they were. I didn't hear enough discourse about what teachers were going through. I didn't hear enough discourse about how principals were trying to get people in the classroom and how administrators and districts were running around the school trying to fill in, and how people were feeding young people out of the cafeteria, right? So we only look at education when we're trying to construct problems, and we don't look at education when we're trying to, you know, honor the work that people are engaged in. And then the final piece of it is that I think education has always been, but is increasingly in the contemporary context, become such a flashpoint for our political conflicts, to the point where you pile all that on, and it's no wonder that we're experiencing, you know, people not wanting to go into this line of work. So I think it, it connects to this long history, but it's intensified in the current moment in a way that I think is a problem. So that's sort of my take on the whole thing. I don't know if it connects specifically to your question, but I think there may be a connection. At least somebody out there can make a connection, but I think.
I think that that's spot on. I think everything you were saying really resonates with me. We run here in DC a fellowship called Seeding Disruption, and we always do consultancies for dilemmas that educators. It's a cross-sector conversation, so it's education, but it's also all things that affect children and families. So healthcare, libraries, juvenile justice, law enforcement. So all of these different folks working in these arenas were coming together to have this conversation just a couple of weeks ago. And one of the dilemmas that I was facilitating for was specifically about teacher shortages, the number of people calling off every day, inability to get subs. So I think we can't underestimate the toll that the pandemic has taken on everybody, and in particular on educators. When it was a hard job when I was a principal, well before a pandemic. And so, and an all-consuming job. And so to be a teacher or an administrator at this time when it feels like everything's being stripped of you is and I can't imagine also, being a young Black or brown person thinking about education and then finding out I can't talk about any of the things that deeply affect my own life in my classroom for fear of being persecuted or fired from my job. It's just not a sexy place right now.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Michelle and John have both shared. I think, Aaliyah, it comes down at the end of the day to, we really need to have a larger conversation about what actually is going on in the classroom. That includes conversations about teachers' mental health. We have a lot of conversations about what students are dealing with and how they're struggling. But I've noticed that teachers and the support for teachers, they often get left out in these conversations. And so I'm glad that unfortunately, we have to have this conversation, but I am glad that we're engaging in this discussion right now. A lot of things need to change. Teachers need more support at the end of the day. The thing about it is, and a lot of folks don't often talk about this, but technology also plays a role in everything that's going on now. There was once a time when my mother and my grandmother were in school where there was only but so much on the curriculum. And that's what you knew, that's what you were given, that's what you were taught, or that's what you were told to teach, and that's what the students learned. It's a lot more difficult today because there's access to so much more information. Curriculums are expanding. Teachers have to scramble to figure out, well, what's the appropriate way to teach this? Where can I go to get this textbook? And then if they want to get a textbook, can all my students afford the textbook? So there are larger conversations, and you see these integrations between classroom implementation and then the economy. What's going on with this extends into a bigger conversation about the future of work. We really need to be asking these larger questions and having conversations about if what is currently being taught in the classroom is helping inform and helping prepare our students for the future. And I would argue that these types of conversations about real issues facing Americans today, conversations about history and how I even got here, how Michelle even got here, how John got here. These are the important conversations that helps me to be able to relate to my peers, people above me, and people coming after me. And so I would challenge elected officials, specifically state superintendents and others, to really be engaging in these conversations at the ground level and asking questions of what needs to be added to these curriculums, what needs to be changed, and how can we support teachers and students in the things that they feel are the most pressing and the most important for them to be engaged in as they continue on past K-12, past post-secondary into the real world.
Yeah, and just this idea of support, I think it sort of raised something for me, because a lot of times we put the onus on teachers to deal with anti-CRT efforts, right? But where are the voices of those who could speak up to create the conditions under which they wouldn't have to feel so threatened?
Mhm.
Where are the, the deans of schools of education? They should be able to speak up for these fundamental core principles of not censoring books and not squelching conversations about race, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes, schools are supposed to be the space where we're sort of building the future of our democracy. And we can't have an honest conversation about how we got here,
Yeah.
as you were saying,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Where are those voices? Where are the voices that are going to fight back against that racial ignorance and racial ideology that's putting so much pressure on educators in schools, right? I think we need boldness. We need voices of people who are using their power to speak truth to that power, right? To speak truth and justice in their work. Or we see what we believe in, some of us, and I hope we believe in it, because the ultimate problem is, absent that kind of pushback, I don't know what the future of our democracy looks like. To the extent that it exists, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what the future of the ability to vote looks like,
Mhm.
because we're walking back everything that protects people's right to vote,
Mhm.
right? I don't know what it means to be in power, to have a title, if you can't speak up, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, for me, I feel this very intensely because I'm worried
Mhm.
about where we're headed. And I think we have to speak up.
Just want to add one more thing to this conversation. For me, as somebody who is a policy professional, somebody who has worked in government, someone who has taught in academia, and someone who's also a daughter of an educator, I'd love to see the day when I can come into the classroom and help facilitate these conversations without fear of saying the wrong thing, losing my job, offending someone. Because really, when you think about it, and as a sociologist, in a lot of ways, we're all sociologists. We really are all people who we study what's going on and we try to come up with solutions to these issues. But I think that that's the best way for us to really have these conversations deeply, is if we allow others who have studied these conversations and studied these issues to go into these spaces, be a part of the teaching, be a part of the hands-on classroom activity. I know that the Department of Education currently has some funding set aside to actually support that type of model. Not a lot of folks are aware of it, but in the Every Student Succeeds Act, short for, or it's also known as ESSA. ESSA is short for Every Student Succeed. There's a set aside amount, I believe it's 25 or 26% of funding that the Secretary of Education is obligated to set aside for grant funding. And so what that funding provides, it allows professors from higher education institutions, it allows folks who work in nonprofits or for-profit organizations to go into schools, their expertise, and bring in their policy, bring in their real world work and experience into the classroom and help teachers teach on these very difficult current issues that we're facing. And I think that we really need that community model in order to be successful.
So let me bring our audience into the room, both present and virtually. Could you step to the mic and frame your question, and we'll try to not have everyone answer it, but one person who's particularly speaks to that point. We want to start bringing in some of the virtual questions by Dr. Wimberly in the back. So go ahead.
Hi, good evening. This is just such a fascinating conversation. My name is Mia Smith-Bynum. I'm the Senior Director for Science, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the American Psychological Association. And I came to this talk, thank you so much for the invitation, because it does feel like we are rolling back all of the gains imperfect though they may be, of the civil rights movement. And we're looking at the consequences of Brown. And what's on my mind this evening is the likely deconstruction of affirmative action that's about to come down. And if you all could comment on the implications of that for upward mobility, particularly as the country is becoming more diverse and in the current lived reality of income inequality. And thank you so much for your comments.
John, go for it.
I'm gonna go back a little bit, and I'm gonna set the context for everybody else to answer. So, I mean, for me, taking a big picture sort of look at this, for me, a big part of what's happening right now is an effort to consolidate white supremacy. And as the population demographics are shifting, to try to consolidate sort of white control over most of the institutions of society. So that's why you see an attack on voting rights. That's why you see an attack on affirmative action. That's why you see, you know, the ways in which these interlocking systems of oppression are all demonstrating their connection across a broad array of activities in the society that are all coalescing around the consolidation of white supremacy, cis-heteropatriarchy, exploitative capitalism, et cetera, right? So I feel like that sort of, for me, sets a backdrop against which this conversation might be happening, because otherwise we sort of see these things as all disparate and disconnected, and I think we lose sight of the bigger picture. Now, for me, the other piece of this is, it's really ironic to me that with all the things that get considered in admitting students to college, affirmative action is the thing you're coming at, right? Legacy, and as Ketanji Brown Jackson talked about, oboe playing, all these things, region, all these things can be considered, but you can't consider race in a society where white supremacy is dominated from the beginning of the republic, right? So it's clearly, and yes, legal scholars will say, you know, strict scrutiny, and I don't know, I'm not a legal scholar, but there are, you know, where there are certain categories that get more attention, but there are other motivations here that don't necessarily have to do with fairness and getting admitted to college. The implications, I think, are that you get a reduction in certain groups being at institutions. And remembering that affirmative action was put in place because institutions wouldn't admit non-white folks to the school, right? They were more likely to admit men. They were excluding women from school, right? So affirmative action was put in place to respond to these things, and these things still exist. So taking affirmative action away takes us back to that kind of reality. So that was kind of long-winded. I tend to do this, so that was me setting the table.
I'm just gonna ask for the follow-up from Dr. Alden Morris, the mentor and advisor of Dr. Diamond. Alden.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for such a rich conversation about these important issues. And secondly, to congratulate John on a very challenging and provocative lecture. My concern is this. For a long time now, I have struggled with trying to maintain optimism. And John, your talk was a lot on the downsides of Brown. Now, I was profoundly moved by Michelle Molitor, very bold and courageous conversation, analyzing her own father and the color line. I really admired you being able to do that the way you did. Now, my question is this, or my issue is this. So I moved into a middle-class neighborhood, largely of white students, 30 years ago. My kids were young. And the school there was a good school. Elementary school was a good school. It was about 70% white. A few more blacks moved into the neighborhood, and all of a sudden, white kids just left school. And I said to my wife, damn, we didn't get that memo. I mean, how does this just happen like that? So I came to the conclusion, and regretfully so, because I believe in solidarity and I believe in love. But I came to the conclusion that most white people do not want to be close up around Black people. That there's some sort of profound dislike and distrust and so forth of white people toward Black people. They don't want their kids around young Black kids and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering, are we wasting our time trying to convince white people that they should do the right thing? When it seems to me over and over again, that does not happen. And so are we throwing our energies into the wrong place? And Michelle, I kind of direct this question to you because you have struggled with this within your own family. Is it worth our fight to be trying to convince white people that they ought to do the right thing and to love justice and mercy and all of that?
It's an easy question, huh? You know, I think for me and my lived experience, I think in general, I think of integration as not just being about school. I think of integration as being about society and it being about, I think of integration as being more about society and how we want to be with each other overall versus about convincing white people of anything. I think that when I think about my own personal crusade around this, I think it's really about dreaming and working toward the world that I want to be a part of, not about convincing white folks to change. I think that there are white people who are a part of that, but that's not where I spend my energy. I'm really focused on wanting to work with people who want to work on this and helping build skills and capacity and community among people who want to be in solidarity with one another. I do think that we overall need to do a much better job of campaigning for love and for solidarity. The campaign for hate is strong and loud. And I don't think that we have not yet figured out how to construct a narrative. I think Reverend Barber is probably the closest right now of really trying to construct a different narrative, but it's got to be picked up and adopted by a lot of us, all of us, if we're hoping to see the changes that are being rolled back nationally. I think in my own family, I don't talk to a lot of white people in my family, if I'm honest, but I love my dad. And I think my relationship with him keeps me honest in my fight and keeps me honest and also trying to understand what is it within, you know, his 7 generations back of trauma and narrative that live in his body that are working on him all the time needs to be healed and unpacked. And what's the healing and unpacking I have to continue to do so that I can show up and be in relationship with people who look like me and people who don't.
I too think it's very courageous for you to talk about your experience and the complexity with which you talked about it. I love the question, and Alden, thank you so much for being here and for your kind words about the lecture. I mean, part of the question for me is, I often think about this when I'm working with people and talking with them and thinking about my own life. Like, I don't have a whole lot of faith that the majority of white folks want to hang out with me, want to go to school, But on some level, you exposed me to Patricia Hill Collins' work, right? Which exposed me to a lot of Black feminist scholarship, which taught me that there are multiple forms of oppression interlocking at the same time, right? So you all heard my narrative. I'm a Black man, but I'm Black, but I'm also a man, right? I'm Black, but I was also middle class. I'm Black, but I'm also happen to be straight. So what makes the vast majority of women of all races want to deal with men, right? Like, they have a whole lot of faith that we're gonna be right. What makes working class and poor people invested in listening to anything I have to say as somebody who's middle class and very comfortable, right? What does a LGBTQI person, what does a queer person have to care about what I have to say, right? Because most people like me are not really working to help them, right? So on some level, we got to try to, I think it's just part of our humanity to recognize that we have all of these things in us and those biases and structural inequalities and structural positions in all of us. But we, on some level, I feel like my humanity depends on me working to create spaces of possibility, right? And I can't give up. My mother was always optimistic on some level, so I'm pessimistic in a lot of ways, but I mean, I'd rather be open to being critiqued and critiquing and engaging than to just shut myself off from everyone, because I'm part of the problem too. So.
Let me just, I'm going to turn it back to the final wrap up, but I wanted to be sure we had some input from our, several thousand who are joining on the live web stream. George, why don't you maybe frame a couple of questions that you synthesized and just pose them both, and then we'll grapple with how we're going to answer them.
Okay, great. There are two questions here, Dr. Diamond. One, so you referenced some of your work around family and community engagement or family community partnerships with schools. Can you talk a little bit more about what role do families and communities play in the fight along the color line?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll respond by saying, education doesn't happen in isolation in a vacuum. And that I think, education and community has historically been deeply connected. And I think there are lots of possibilities for building on the strength of communities to enhance what's happening inside of schools. Likewise, there is a lot of good educational work that's happening in community spaces, right? Bianca Baldridge, who's here, her work speaks directly to this, right? There are a lot of folks who are thinking about the connection between community-based education spaces and what happens in the context of schools. And I think we need to sort of build on those resources with the recognition that a lot of the communities that we tend to denigrate actually have a lot to offer for what's happening inside schools. So I would just say that there's possibility there for collective work.
And to follow up,
Yeah, good.
one last question. So what are some of the research gaps you see along this line?
Research gaps.
Research gaps.
I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the kind of spaces outside of schools. There's a lot of work that needs to be sort of break out of the focus on test scores and measures of accountability and discussions about learning loss, to recognize that education is a lot more than measuring how well somebody does on a test. That education is about helping people be able to create a vision for the future and make it manifest in the future. It's about being able to think deeply and critically. There are a lot of ways I think that we need to be expanding how we're thinking about our educational research that doesn't rely on us, sort of just mapping test scores over time, right? To broaden our perspective on what education really is all about, but I should let others jump in.
Yeah, I just would like to add that I think there needs to be some more research on state and local elections and how school boards play a role in this. I think it's really important for folks. A lot of the times we focus just on voting for the president, or some people will go even further to vote for the governor of their state. But these conversations are happening at the school board level. And so it's really important for communities, families to be engaged at that level as well. They need to be having these conversations at the parent-teacher conference, at the PTA meeting, really raising these questions. A couple of statistics have recently come out suggesting that I think it's about, there's one survey that said 86% of parents across party lines are okay and want their children to be having these conversations about slavery and race and LGBTQ+ issues. And so, you know, the media oftentimes instills this fear and distorts our perception of what folks really want. And so we really need to do some more research on what families are voting for, who they're voting for, and what are the issues that they care the most about.
Let's take one from, and then I'll turn it back to Aaliyah for the final wrap up here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation this evening. My name is Malcolm Woodland. I'm excited to be here tonight and former AERA postdoctoral fellow, so almost feel like I'm coming home a little bit in this discussion. But my question is about the role of HBCUs as it pertains to really much of what you've been talking about tonight. And I'll just leave it there, just kind of the role of HBCUs as a response to so much of the discussion and discourse that's been happening this evening.
Yeah, I'll jump in if it's okay. As I mentioned, my grandfather went to Morehouse, and in some ways, sorry, University of Michigan and David Shome and all the great people I worked with there, but in some ways I wish I had too. But I love Michigan as well. And my son is here and is at Howard University, thankfully, which I'm very excited about. I think HBCUs are critical and a space that needs to be supported and nurtured 100%. In some ways, I wish I could have said more about the power of HBCUs to help young people navigate college, to be happier in college, actually, and to do better when they leave. So I think it's critical that we continue to support HBCUs and nurture those institutions.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what John is sharing. And when you think about learning, learning is cultural. So you have to understand that there is culture attached to how somebody learns. And so HBCUs create that cultural space, that cultural environment. It's not just a feeling of being home. I attended a PWI. However, similar to John, there are many times when I think what if I would have gone to an HBCU? What are the things, where would I be now if I would have had the mentoring that I didn't get when I went to a PWI, if I would have had the networking and the social access to different forms of capital that an HBCU may offer to me as a Black woman that I wasn't able to access at a predominantly white institution. And so I would say, absolutely, there's a cultural aspect attached to learning, and we got to keep that in mind. HBCUs play an incredible role, a primary role really, in making sure that that culture stays in place, and making sure that students from other cultures and other races learn in accordance to who they are, where they come from. And so that's fundamental, and we need to make sure that continues.
Great. Well, if we have no more questions, I will let our panelists each offer about a minute each of, concluding thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah. Start with you, Akilah.
So I really want to thank everyone for being a part of this conversation. I know we did most of the talking and we really enjoyed the questions that came in, but for me, I always enjoy having these conversations because it gives me an opportunity to reflect on the work that I'm doing now. And ask myself if I'm meeting the mark. And so I think it's important for us to continue to have these spaces. Thank you, AERA, for allowing this space to be public and for allowing us to have this conversation. But I would love to have conversations with each of you afterwards and really just challenge you when you leave here to think about what conversations are you having in your homes? What conversations are you having on your at your workplace? And are you challenging the status quo? Are you challenging some structures that have just been there for an extensive period of time that you may have a question about or you may take issue with? It's really important for us to speak up. We are the ones that are engaging in this space, and we need to share this knowledge with other folks.
Yeah. I want to also say thank you for everybody who is here and everyone who's in the viewing audience all over the world. I think for me, I'm leaving with, believe it or not, more hope. The fact that this conversation is happening and it's happening in the way it is, I think that there's real opportunity for us to continue to engage in coalition building. And my greatest hope is that that we leave and think about what are the connections that I have made with other people and how can I develop new connections that need to be made. So just an encouragement to keep building.
Yeah, I'm leaving with a strong sense of gratitude for having the opportunity to be invited to say a few things that I think might be important to folks. And I'm also really grateful to this panel for deep engagement in this conversation. I've learned a lot from you, and I thank you all. And I guess the final thing that I would say is these are all linked struggles. We need to be fighting against white supremacy, but we also need to be fighting lots of other battles. We need to be fighting anti-Semitism, right? We need to be fighting against patriarchy. And I've said some of this before, but I really do believe that we can't allow our primary identity or our primary structural position. I can't just have an argument and a fight about what's happening to Black people. I've got to be able to broaden that and join the fight against all forms of oppression. And I would urge people to think that way and to move that way and to act that way. Because again, I feel like our future and our humanity depends on us opening up and understanding that all of these struggles are linked, and we can do something to hopefully make things better. We may not resolve everything, but working together, I think, will push us in a direction that would at least make us feel better about where we are and hopefully make our reality a little bit brighter. So I would stop there.
I think that is the perfect place to stop. I mean, so much of what we were examining really speaks to how we need to come together around these issues and deal with these intersectionalities in meaningful and progressive ways that can make a difference. We can see how the foundations of knowledge add to that. It's been a terrible set of circumstances that may have brought us to the place of recognizing in every social institution in society the kind of rethinking we need to do in associations like ours and nonprofit organizations like ours. The corporate sector universities are going through this thinking. And yes, with every 5 steps forward, there'll be tours along the way, and it may be to reaffirm the paradigms that we're trying to break out of. But from the questions here and from what I was perching over George's shoulder as he was looking at the Q&As from the many who've joined us virtually, I think we can be hopeful that together we can make the kind of changes that are so important to make a difference for our species versus those who will really succumb if we don't make a change. So I just want to thank everyone here for coming. For those in the virtual space, please join us again next year. And for those who are here, we're going to have a great reception. We're going to look to the future. And John, thank you for being the catalyst for an excellent, excellent, thoughtful, research-based policy and practice. I've got those bullets on my bullets in my own little notebook, and really the commentators and you as a moderator handled the interaction so well, and I'm just so pleased that we've been able to bring you here with us. Same time next year. Thank you.